There we are. We are live on YouTube and welcome everyone to Outreach Noah Studies. Ronald, how you doing?
I'm good, Terry. Yourself?
Yeah, we haven't had any, looks like Ernestine's coming in
Yes.
and Linda's joined us. Welcome, Linda. And tonight we have Ann with us, Veronica, of course, Ronald over in the engineering room, running everything. Have we had anything come in through our Gmail? I know last week was a big doozy. It was a
No,
good class.
no. You must be getting your point across.
There you go. It must be. Surprises me sometimes. So I know I can, as Scotty and I used to say, I can open up a can of worms sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, what can we start with? We said our hellos. We've mentioned everybody in the room. Welcome to everybody tuning in on YouTube and those who will later tune in on Power Faith Radio. Any questions you may have for us or any contact you'd like to make, you can email us at outreachnoah@gmail.com. Okay.
Sounds good.
Yeah. We'll let
I
you.
guess your weather's getting cooler and ours beginning to get warmer.
Yep. Yeah, it has cooled down a little bit in the last few days, although we've had a couple of higher days for this time of the year. But,
Here in southeast where I'm at, we have what we call like a false fall. Then we have false springs. Then we have it's going to be spring today, and then tomorrow goes no, we're going to have winter. Because like I said, it was a weekend or so, it hit it was 80 something degrees, and the next day it was snowing. It was crazy.
yeah, that's an
My brother had
extreme.
the same thing out in Oklahoma. It was 90 something out there, and the next morning it was 24. And so that's Fahrenheit for all y'all that's down under.
Yeah, it was 64 here at the moment.
Not too far, probably from, I think we're in the 70s right now.
Yeah, we might get there today.
So, all righty, Ronald. Guess what we get to do? We get to start chapter 4.
Yeah.
Been a long time coming. We have had a journey from the first verse of Genesis. Now we're coming to chapter 4, which in the tonight and the next few weeks, as we work our way to verse 7, a lot of really good information. I'm really looking forward to, especially when we get to verse 6 and 7, because I've been studying those passages for over 15 years. Before I even started on this path, something attracted me to the conversation that God had with Cain. And I read it and I studied it. And then, back in 2010, 11, met up with a rabbi, studied under him for a year and started learning some Hebrew. And later got Rabbi Hirsch's Chumash, who breaks down the Hebrew in these passages. And that one he really does well. And there's a lot to learn there. It's going to be really good. But tonight we're going to cover the birth of Cain and Abel. And then next week we'll get into the offerings, which is very important. There's been some misunderstandings of what those offerings were, what they represent, what they picture, what they're shadows of. Well, they're not really shadows of anything. But we're going to learn a lot about what the offerings were. There's a surprise in there about Abel's offering that some people really probably doesn't know, because they don't know a lot about Cain. We're going to learn about Cain a little bit this actually over the next several weeks. It's important to know his position in the family. We're going to be learning that, because that makes a big difference in what God tells him in verse 7 about who he was, who his position was. It's really, really good, and how we can relate to that in our own lives. So let's get on into chapter 4, verse 1, where it says, Adam had known his wife, Chava, and she conceived and gave birth to Cain. And she said, I have acquired a man with God. In verse 2, the first two ones that we're going to cover. She gave birth again, this time to his brother Havel. And Havel became a shepherd, but Cain was a tiller of ground. Real interesting information there when we get to that point. And as usual, my source of material tonight, my main source is the Hirsch Chumash Bereishis, or Genesis. And I'll be going through his teachings on these passages as we have been. Rabbi Hirsch, here where it says, I acquired a man from Hashem. The word there where it says, go back here, where it says, I acquired a man with God. The word, we're going to get into the word acquired here in a second, but the word for man here is the word ish. It's not the word Adam, which is also translated as man sometimes. But this here is that she acquired an ish. And we know that the ish is man and isha is woman. But in this passage, the Torah tells us that the word is ish. And the word ish means master, social order, and also it can represent the firstborn that exercised power over siblings. And that's an important thing to understand as we go through verse 1 all the way up through the conversation with Cain and Abel, that Cain is an ish. He had a specific power, that a responsibility within the family, that he operated over the siblings, which would have been Havel or any other children. Rabbi Hirsch goes on and says the original concept of ownership, we're going to go back up here to where it says she acquired. So the original concept of ownership hinges on the concept of production. Man's primary asset is his strength. Hence, the primary meaning of the Hebrew word that's translated as acquired is not an acquisition by money. It's not an acquisition. This passage where she said she acquired, it was not an acquisition by money, but an acquisition by strength and power. The example that Rabbi Hirsch gives is the same word is used when it says that God is the owner of heaven and earth. When we read that in the Torah, that Hashem says, I am the owner of heaven and earth, that means he acquisitioned this ownership through power and strength, which, of course, he is the power. He's the one who created it. But that's how he acquired it. Through the power of his creative abilities, he acquired ownership of all creation. And that's the reason, like when we read in Genesis chapter 1, where he, in the beginning, Elohim created, we can see here, we get the laws and understandings of idolatry, that there's only one. Thus, the creator, he is the owner of heaven and earth. Thus, he's the only one to be worshiped. He's the only one to be prayed to. So we can get an element here in this secondary understanding of the word acquired through strength and power, that he is the only God. In chapter 14, 19 and 22, it says, and it's another example of the word acquired here. It says, and he blessed him, and he said in verse 19, chapter 14, he blessed him and he said, blessed be Abraham, to God, the Most High, owner of heaven and earth. So this is where we get God, owner, heaven and earth, in Genesis chapter 14, 19. Verse 22, where it says, but Abraham said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted up my hand toward God, the Most High, owner of heaven and earth. And Rabbi Hirsch says here, the word owner is the same exact spelling, the same word that's used here when Eve said that she acquired a man. It denotes the moral aspect of ownership. It denotes the legal concept of property, ownership by right, not possession by force. So she had ownership. She acquired this ownership of this man with God through right, not through money and not through just force. So Rabbi Hirsch goes on and says, the owner of heaven and earth because he created them. By extension, also, it represents, that's how he pulls this out. This word for owner or acquisition is also like a stalk which produces blossoms and flowers. So too in our verse, through the sacrifice of my strength, I have acquired a male human being with God's help and assistance. So that you can use this word that's for ownership and acquiring as to be like a stalk that blooms flowers. That the stalk is like it's the owner actually of the blooms and the blossoms. If it wasn't for it, the blooms and the blossoms wouldn't exist. And so in the Hebrew, you can see how they use these words differently in grammatical tenses. He goes on and said the first elated reaction of the first mother was a feeling of self-pride. This is interesting, which constitutes a distortion of the pure consciousness of motherhood. A mother imbued with the spirit of duty would have first remembered God. She would have thought that the new duties and tasks that came with God's gift. The reaction of self-pride reflected a distorted attitude and was a display of egotism and may have affected the character of the son whose name expresses even greater self-pride. So how's he saying that? We go back up to the passage. He says, I have acquired a man with God. She put Ish first. She could have said, with God, I acquired a man. But the Torah tells us when Hashem told Moses to write this down, she said, I acquired a man with God, putting this child first instead of saying, with God's help, I had a baby. I had a male child. And so Rabbi Hirsch is saying, because of the wording of this passage, we see that she had an issue with self-pride, haughtiness. So we're starting to learn a little bit about her character. And then she expresses it even through the name of her first child. The name Cain comes from a root that means the shaft that bears the tip of a spear. And that's mentioned like in 2 Samuel 21:16. And so it says, and he goes on, he says, and it grieves over the loss of his possession. Indeed, only when a possession is lost do we feel it in full value. So she had this issue with haughtiness. She names her child Cain, which has an essence of egotism there, meaning the shaft that bears the tip of a spear. Rabbi Hirsch goes on and says, in the Hebrew word yadi, where it says had known, where it says Adam had known his wife, is written in the past tense. It's in the past, what's called the past perfect tense. Through that statement, the sages have stated that it's very possible that Cain was born in Eden, in paradise, because of the past tense use of the word that he had known. Known was past tense. He goes on and says, the happy mother named him Cain, signifying that she had acquired him by her own efforts. Because of the nature of his name, she is now even saying, even though she bore it with God, but she put the male child, before God. And therefore, Rabbi Hirsch is saying we see here in his name that she was even seeing that it was by her own efforts, because she says, I acquired. But by the time the second son was born, anxiety gnawed at her. In such a circumstance, a child is likely to be an additional burden. Hava's mood was not joyful when she named her second son, Havel, which means transitories, short-lived. According to some of the sages, Cain and Havel were twins and were both born in paradise. Because again, of the wording, because when it said that she had acquired a man with God, in the second verse says she gave birth again. So there is some discussion between the sages and the teachers of the Torah of Israel, that the wording does leave a hint that Adam or Cain and Abel could have been twins and both born before being expelled out of the garden. Havel's name has a basic meaning that means to obstruct, prevent, or to stop. It denotes a place that has no opening for light, a high wall that prevents access. So you can see her mood. Now we start seeing what his name means, what it represents. Avel, same letters as Havel. I mean, not the exact same letters, but Avel, which is like a root of Havel, means to grieve over the loss of life. Hence, Havel also means a chain that binds. It denotes transitorious existence whose continuity is checked. So she had this negative feeling when she's naming the second child. Some sages said has actually in other areas I've read where that she did not want another child, that this was going to be a burden. And also with her haughtiness, she's seen that everything was going to be given over to Cain, since he was the firstborn. In verse 2, the word that is translated as herder, that he was a shepherd or herder, the root word has three meanings. The first one means to graze and to seek fodder, to nourish the body. B, to seek intellectual nourishment, to ponder and to investigate. And also to join up with someone to seek social gratification in a company of another person. That actually comes from Hosea 12. To take satisfaction in empty things, like sitting out in the field, watching the sheep. We're going to get into the occupation here. It's really interesting. We'll get into the occupation here in verse 2. Anything before we continue on in verse 2? Nothing going on there? Okay. So we see here that the herder, Havel, the occupation that he had chosen, and if we know what a shepherd really is, from thinking about it, one who, seeks to graze, to fodder, to nourish the body, to seek intellectual nourishment and ponder and investigate. A lot of shepherds, like King David, I'd say a lot of his psalms was written sitting out on the hillside watching sheep. They also get gratification within social meetings with other people. The Aramaic translation, Rabbi Hirsch says, is the essence is to want to seek. That we should note further that in the first tense refers animals to shepherds and also pasturage. So even in the Aramaic, it has this essence of wanting to seek. That lines up with pondering and investigating and intellectual nourishment. Shepherds are kind of what we call today heady, thinking, pondering. Philosophers, a lot of philosophers would line up, or philosophy would line up because they're pondering life, pondering the universe. Rabbi Hirsch goes, it says, it seems strange that in the second half of verse 2, Havel is mentioned before Cain. See, in verse 2, she gave birth again, this time to her brother Havel. Havel came a shepherd, and Cain was a tiller of the ground. So we see here that the second born is mentioned first in this passage. So he says it seems to be strange that Havel is mentioned before Cain, even though Cain was the firstborn. And indeed, Cain is mentioned first in 2 verses that follow. The explanation lies in the occupations chosen by the 2 brothers. The reason why Cain's or Abel's name is mentioned first in chapter 2 or verse 2 is because of the occupations. Man's natural occupation was agricultural. He was required, it was mentioned several times, to till the ground, that he would work the ground in order to obtain food. Cain chose the natural occupation. This was the way of if you were going to survive, you're going to need to have some land and grow your food. They didn't have Walmarts and grocery stores on every corner. You had, if you were going to eat, you had to take care of that yourself. Especially back then, there wasn't a lot of farmers around. You were the only ones, so you had to grow. So he did what was natural. Havel, however, turned to a different occupation. And the scriptures stress this fact by mentioning it first. Cain's choice of occupation was the natural one and was self-understood. It was obvious. You're the firstborn. You're going to have to learn to till the ground. A sharp contrast between the two brothers will later reveal itself. Yet the Torah says nothing about them specifically, except for the difference in their vocation. As we're going to see, that the choice of vocation also represents and reveals to us their character. The implication is that the vocation's difference suggests differences in character and qualities, differences that later will manifest themselves acutely in the history of the nations of the world. We are referring to the contrast between agricultural and pastoral peoples. My wife and I have had some really interesting discussions about this week. I've been talking about and sharing with her about really a significant meaning between the two first sons, the first siblings, and how they represent pretty much the two types of peoples that's in the world: agricultural and pastoral. The root of this contrast can be seen in the first pair of brothers who differed in their choices of occupations. Agricultural demands of one's physical energies. If anybody's got family, farms, like both my grandparents were farmers. Now my dad's mom and dad really didn't work the land. They had land that that they leased out and stuff. But my mom's parents, they were farmers. My papa was a Kentucky tobacco farmer, and I learned a lot when I used to go out and spend summers and different times out there riding. When I was little bitty, riding on the tobacco wagon when they were cutting it and putting it on the wagon. My cousins was putting it up in the barn. Now, Papa didn't use pesticides. I learned to go out there, and I don't know if you want to Google what a tobacco worm looks like. It's big. It's about that big around. It's long. It's green. And we would take our thumbs, thump the heads off of them, throw them on the ground. We wormed the tobacco field with my cousins and my grandparents. And then when I finally got big enough, got to ride on the sled, the tobacco setter. Two people sat on it. It was pulled by the tractor. One would put the tobacco plant in the middle, and as it went, it would open up a furrow. You would set the plant in it. It would close it up, and another person would put the other plant. They were farmers working the ground, and so I got a taste of that growing up with my mama and papa. So it's a demand on one's physical energies, and it was. And I'd watch my cousins climb the rafters to the top of the tobacco barn, and it could be 40 feet up. And then they're standing there, and the one on the wagon's handing up. You got these sticks. It's got all this tobacco on it. One's picking it, handing it to this one. This one's handing it to this one. This one's handing it out, and it goes all the way to the top. They work it out, and then they come out and down to the next level. It's really hard work. Rabbi Hirsch goes on and says, the divine decree by the sweat of your brow is applicable particularly to the tiller of the soil. He must devote himself totally to his physical existence. Self-pride of possession, implicit in the terms acquired, acquisition, are especially predominant to the tiller of the soil. The ground that the farmer has fertilized with his own sweat becomes his supreme value, becomes a part of his personality. And he is caught up in it, and then he settles down in it. The farmer becomes who his ground makes. Anybody knows farmers that are out there tilling the ground. they take ownership in that ground. They've got to take care of those crops when it goes in from the seed all the way up to the fruits until they're harvesting. It takes everything they've got. They got to be careful nobody comes in and does anything to their property, steals. So, I mean, it takes their whole being when they're a farmer. Then Rabbi Hirsch goes on and says, to be sure, agriculture stimulates and develops civilization. Without it, we wouldn't have civilization. You know, we all talk about the farmers today. They feed the nation. They're very important. It's one of the lowliest jobs, you know, as far as a lot of intellectuals think, but it's one of the most important because it feeds the civilization. So it's very important. Most inventions and skills may be credited to agriculture. Noah, he became a man of the earth. He's also known to be the one who invented the plow. And so you can see how things happened as agricultural grew and civilizations grew. And like even here in the South, when they invented the cotton gin and then the weavers to weave the, I mean, it continues to go that the agriculture stimulates and develops civilization. It stimulates inventions and skills, all created by the occupation of agriculture. The settlement of the land is implicit in agriculture, leads to the formation of society and state and administrations of justice. The decree upon man to work the ground opened up the way for man's development. Now, you remember when we were talking about, go back a few weeks when we were talking about when Adam was expelled from the garden, Rabbi Hirsch shows that him being brought into the garden was through mercy. Him being expelled from the garden was through mercy. He had a choice in the garden. He had two paths, the path of life, the path of death. He chose the path of death. When he was expelled out of the garden, remember, he was created outside. The Torah says, you know, it says when we were in there that when Adam was brought out of the garden, he went back to the ground which he knew. And the stage of man in the garden, he was destined to worship God and to serve, and to serve God there. But when he came out, when he was told he was going to have to till the ground, then the ground becomes a training. We talked about how coming outside the garden, it became a training ground to prepare man to serve. Where in the garden, he was just going to serve. He was already there. But when he lost his way, now he has to go through an education to learn how to serve, to learn to serve God. And Rabbi Hirsch, we covered a lot of that when we were talking about when he came out, when he was brought outside of the garden. It was familiar territory. If you remember, it was familiar territory. Eve, it wasn't. It was all new. All she knew was what was inside the garden. But it was all new for her. But for him, it was, he was in his own hood. He knew the neighborhood. He knew, but this time he was going to have to work it in a different way than what he did before. Rabbi Hirsch goes on and says, on the other hand, a farmer is a slave to his field. Remember, he's a slave. He has to depend on on nature, the weather. He becomes a slave. Droughts and rains and all this stuff can affect his plants. And he has to pay attention. He puts his whole life into this plot of land that he has just now plowed and planted. He becomes a slave to it. Rabbi Hirsch says, which lowers him to the level of the soil. It lowers him to the level of the soil. Once he places his neck under the yoke of the pursuit of possessions, his spirit too becomes bowed. He can be manipulated through his desire of the property. People wanting to come and take your land. We've seen a lot of like videos and stuff back in the, the growing stages of the United States. People would move out west and they would stake a ground, and then people would want to come, and take their land from them, even kill them so they could take their land. So they became yoked to the possession of the land. And all it has is, if you own it, then you got to take care of it. You got to protect it. Somebody can come and steal it. Somebody can come and damage it. So you're yoked to that. That's why they say a lot, be happy with your lot in life with what you have. The more you have, the more you become a slave to it. And agriculture breeds into that. The agricultural spirit breeds into that possession mentality. He said, this leads to slavery. One of man's subjugates to another. See, when people, back in the day when they had slaves, the landowner needed more people to work the property. Back then, it was through slaves. It wasn't hired help like it is today. But they would capture and they would take over other people, and they'd bring them in and would make them slaves to work. So now your possessions is now affecting other people. You see how all of it's so interesting on just learning what the occupation was and how it defines the character and the nature of Cain. So he goes on, he says, moreover, the farmer can easily come. Now, this is when I found out that I had Scottish heritage and I started learning about the Celts and things. I learned a lot about their reliance on nature and how all their gods were related to the different powers of nature. And this is what Rabbi Hirsch is saying here. It says, moreover, the farmer, we're talking about at this time, can easily come to worship the forces of nature on whose influences hinges the success of his field. They'd worship the sun, they'd worship the moon, they'd worship the winds and the rains, all the different powers. The farmer, especially at that time, not as much as today, but in certain ancient cultures, this is how they came to worship the different forces of nature. I mean, I actually met and worked with for a short period of time and had some very interesting conversation with an Irish man who was an Irish Celtic witch, trained in the powers, certain powers of changing nature. Very interesting discussions I had with him about them and their gods. Their relationship with their gods isn't like what we see in the Torah, where they're bowing down and worshiping these gods. These gods controlled nature and they had relationships with them, but it wasn't like in a worship form that we see here in Torah, what we see in Moab and all of these things that Israel runs into. So it was interesting to sit and listen to him talk about the different gods and the different relationships you'd have. And he said, some of them, you just get mad at them, you cuss them, do whatever you tell them to do. I'm like, really? This is a guy. He said, they're just a god. They ain't, and he just throw his hand up. And I thought, okay, this is a total different thing than I've learned from about, deities. But that particular group had a different relationship with their deities, and I thought that was really interesting. And then I would talk to him about Torah. He'd let me share Torah with him. He found Torah very interesting. But yeah, a farmer can easily become to worship the forces of nature that influences and hinges the success or the failure of his field. Because you see a failure of a field, they think, oh, wow, nature's mad at me. So they're worshiping what can we do to make, the nature not be so mad at me. So you can see with success and failure would move farmers, agricultural people like that, to move to worship foreign things. He goes on and says, agricultural people were the first to lose faith in God and in the higher dignity of man. It was in their midst that slavery and idolatry first emerged. He goes on and says, by contrast, there is much virtue and advantage in pastoral life. The shepherd works mainly with living creatures, and the care he extends to them fosters in him human feelings of tenderness and empathy. His property is movable. The flock needs the shepherd's care, but does not owe its very existence to the shepherd. As a result, the shepherd is saved from the dangers of attracting too much value to himself and to his property. His vocation does not drain all of his energy or occupy his mind to great extents, and he has time to elevate his spirit to the divine and human values. And Rabbi Hirsch goes, hence, our forefathers, Israel, were shepherds, as were Moses and David. He goes, consider the antipathy of the ancient Egyptians toward the shepherds and pastoral peoples. All the negative outgrowths of the agricultural mentality discussed above was found in Egypt. Egyptian culture was based on agriculture. Its characteristics featured were polytheism, and on the one hand, and human enslavement on the other. So we see slavery and idolatry in Egypt because it was an agricultural society. Work was for the purpose of man. The individual per se had no value, no dignity, and no freedom. The Egyptian was born a slave to his occupation. Faith in God and the freedom of man and man's likeness to God remained alive only in the hearts of one tribe, the shepherds. Our forefathers, the forefathers of Israel. The Egyptian leaders were very shrewd in instilling in their people an implacable hatred of pastoral peoples. Rabbi Hirsch says, can we deduce from these latter developments that Havel became a shepherd because of the kind of person he was? By and large, it may be seen that man was destined to till the ground rather than to shepherd sheep. This was also the destiny of Israel, according to the Torah and by the virtue of the Torah. However, the Torah also provided antidotes to the dangers posed by agriculture and institution preventive measures against idolization of property. So a lot of their laws, including the Sabbaths of the lands and the different laws that they have, was instilled in there because they had to be farmers. They had to till the land. but God gave them within their covenant certain things that helped prevented them from becoming having the traits of slavery and idolatry that land produced in the Gentile nations. Said Rabbi Hirsch says the Torah solves the spiritual problem posed by agriculture and calls the establishment of agricultural state whose people serve God and are united in a fraternal equality. But in agricultural societies outside of the sphere of Torah, consciousness of God, along with human freedom and the equality of all man, is in peril. And he ends chapter 2 says, so Havel became a shepherd. Cain, obsessed, became the tiller of soil, obsessed with acquisition, of taking stuff by strength and through power. And so here we have, in the birth of Cain and Abel, a picture of the two characteristics between Israel and the nations. And so we see why the nations has more of an agricultural mentality, because they're always seeking out to put down the shepherd Israel, just like Egypt did. It's a natural tendency of the nations. Now, what's interesting is I've meditated on this week. Rabbi Hirsch brings the point that the two, the agricultural and your shepherding or your pastoral is two types of people. And I got to meditating upon that this week, how it's not only representative of Israel being a shepherd nation and the nations being the agricultural nations in their characteristics as nations, but as individuals. I sat and I pondered this. Since agriculture is about possessing, acquiring, we see a lot of occupations, white collar occupations that go up the ladder, acquiring certain businesses, acquiring this, growing, taking over, the big box stores, taking over the mom and pop stores, constantly acquiring is an agricultural characteristic. Then I got to thinking, in my own life, the majority of my jobs that I've had all my life, I would call pastoral. I've been in service in the trades, heating and air, servicing units. People call them when they're broke. Did water treatment. It's been more pastoral type things, helping people when, in doing things like that in the trades. My wife and daughters have all worked in the past. My eldest daughter still is. She's a general manager of a place over here called Tremont Tavern, but she's been in the service industry since high school. My wife has been in customer service for 30-something years. And those are pastoral type jobs. So I just got to looking at the society. And when you look at the society and you think about it, the pastoral type jobs are always kind of looked down. We see, a lot here now, talking about wanting to bring the trade schools back to, to high schools and colleges, that people have left a lot of the trade works that supply service to the community. Those are always looked down upon. The less paid, which is not that much anymore, because the pay is catching up with the heating and air and the plumbing, especially the heating and air, the technology. I've been out of heating and air for over 15 years, and I was talking to a young man one day. I had come out and work on my unit, and because I got rid of all my tools and plus the new stuff. They're like the automobiles. He told me there's certain brands out there that he's got an app on his phone that he can diagnose the unit before he even leaves his house. It'll tell him what's going on with it, with certain equipment. If you've got a certain style system, it's just like the cars. They've just all the sensors and everything's it's gone crazy. But still, it's a pastoral job. Just you get a chance to think about, job, careers, individuals. There's two characteristics. One's agricultural, which goes after possessions, goes after positions and job. They're wanting to higher up, climbing the ladders. Then you look at the pastorals, the service companies that service the community. And it opened my eyes when I seen this. These two brothers, the first two children of the Bible, represents the two types of nations and the two types of peoples, two types of careers. And there's not a third, there's not a fourth. There's you're either agricultural in character or you're pastoral in character. And I found that really interesting when I got to the end of the verse 2 here, Rabbi Hirsch's. Well, that's what we've got for the first two verses, the birth of Cain and Abel. How's it going, Ronald?
Well, there's no comments, but I found it quite interesting because I've never sort of considered the two systems. Thinking while you're talking about it, I'm thinking about my past work history, pastoral.
Yeah. And like I said, there's nothing wrong with the agricultural. It's just if you have the Torah like he gave Israel, we've got the Torah, the Noahides, it's accepted the 7 laws. And I've got more to say about that because there's other aspects. There's the Derek Eretz, it's the other side of the coin. That deals with the self and how you relate with your society. And but we have the 7 laws when we've accepted them, and we walk with the God of Israel. We learn these things, and it protects us from falling to the vices of the agricultural. Let's say you have an agricultural, character. That there's nothing wrong with that. God created that. That's part of who we are, and He's given different people different characters, but He's also given us ways to guard ourselves so that we're, when we look at agricultural, and then because of that, slavery and idolatry is the two big aspects that comes out of that characteristic. How do we take care of if we're an agricultural type person, and that's our character and that's the way we are? How do we guard ourselves from that? Well, we have the prohibition of idolatry. See, the prohibition of idolatry, when we learn what we're not supposed to worship, there's 4 specific acts that helps us from idolizing our career, idolizing the grabbing of the possessions, knowing that the possessions are now our tools and not just acquisitions. So we have idolatry that helps us with that. Then when we're walking with the Creator, we also know that He breathed into man and He gave every human being a divine spark, a divine soul. So we learn that every human being has, regardless of who they are, and there's some pretty rough people today that we don't want to think like this, but we do. We have to reel ourselves in. Every human being is deserves our respect and honor because of the divine image of God that's in every human being. And therefore, that protects us when we look at humanity as carrying the image of God. Then that takes care of the slave aspect of trying to make people slaves. Not necessarily slaves like back in the day slaves, but there are people who treat people like slaves, like they own them. Certain managers, certain careers, they have this attitude of people are beneath them. And so, but we, praise God's given us the 7 commandments. And with that, even though He's not given us all the commandments like He did Israel, but within the 7 commandments, we can find the guardrails that protects those that are among us that has the agricultural characteristics to help guard them from idolatry and also the treatment, the less treatment of humanity, treating someone lower than yourself, because that person has the exact same image of God that is in you as is in them. And therefore we owe them we may not like the lifestyle they're doing, but we have to show honor and respect to the image of God that's in the person, not how the person's acting. And that's kind of hard sometimes. That's not meaning you have to be tolerant and you have to accept somebody for living certain lifestyles. No, it's just we have to also understand that they may not be living up to the image of God that's in them, but it's still there. And that's a guardrail for us to not treat anyone below us, that we stand equal, shoulder to shoulder as human beings. And so we can't say, well, God didn't give us the Sabbath. God didn't give us this. God didn't give us. Nobody gave us idolatry and blasphemy, theft and murder, forbidden sex. All of these guardrails us from treating our fellow human beings, below us and beneath us. And it also guards us from worshiping anything outside of God himself. That's the beauty of the 7 commandments. He's given us everything. Matter of fact, today, many of y'all know, if you've been around the last couple of weeks, I've started studying Stoicism. It is a philosophy for personal behavior. It's not a religion. It's a philosophy of living life, and it's interesting. Was it today, or was it yesterday's? Hold on, I need to. So I'm turn the page here. Oh, today's meditation came from Epictetus, who was a former Roman slave. He wrote, "Wealth and freedom isn't secured by filling up on your desires, your heart's desires, but by removing your desires." And then Ryan, this guy that I've been studying through, he writes in his modern language, there are 2 ways to be wealthy: to get everything you want, or to want everything you have. And I'm bringing this up because of the guardrails of agricultural, that we become satisfied with what God gives us in life. I wrote down my says, this speaks to me in the realm of being content with your lot in life, what Rabbi Nachman of Breslov teaches about. And one of the things we've got to learn is we must learn to want what we have. And he goes on, he asks, so which is the easier right here and right now? To get everything you want, or to want what you already have? And by wanting what you already have keeps you from desiring possession after possession after possession. And it lines up a lot with what Rabbi Nachman of Breslov teaches on being content with your lot in life. It lines up with what Rabbi Hirsch teaches in Genesis chapter 1, 11, and 12 on species, knowing who God made you, instead of going after and desiring something that you're not. Getting everything you want, that first level of seeking wealth or whatever. Rabbi Hirsch, I wrote this down because I've talked about this a lot with the laws of kind and species. We need to want everything we have. So the oak tree does not desire to be a cedar. That was my last thought that I wrote down this morning. The oak tree doesn't desire to be a cedar. And when we, if the Creator has given you the agricultural mindset, He's also given us ways to learn to control that nature. That's one of the things I'm loving about Stoicism. I'm learning to control things. The biggest tenet is you can only control So you can only control the things that's within your control. The things that's not within your control, we've got to leave alone. And that's the hardest. That's the hardest. And one of the things is I'm learning, because this all started when I had an incident at work with a fellow person that went behind my back on something, and I got involved, and what I said was right, but the way I did it was wrong. And so I've got to fix that in myself. And one of the things I've learned over the last 2 months is that the way someone is outside of my control. Like I'm outside of your control. How I am, the kind of person I am, my characteristics, my habits, my nature is outside of your control. But what's within your control is how we interact with one another, and that's what I was having to do. I'm studying, learning how to have proper interaction, knowing what's in my control and what's not in my control. And to me, this lines up with tonight's lesson, that with the acquisition issue of the agricultural mind. Some people are going to have that, and they're going to have struggles. And the shepherd can too. The shepherd can get haughty and look down at the people who are looking down at him. It's that battle of status. But praise God, we've been given the 7 commandments, and when we meditate on them broadly, we can see how God created Israel and the nations, and he created the Gentiles, the Jews. He created us as individuals, and we all have either one of the two within the society, and learning to live together is the fun part. All right, Ronald. You know me, I'll keep going.
Question?
Go ahead.
You still have a question, Anne?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I was just trying to put my hand up. First question was, are you able to show me the version of the Hirsch Chumash you're reading from?
Yeah, I've got all 5 books. They're individual,
Okay,
Genesis,
so you've got,
Deuteronomy. I've got the
5.
set, but the one I'm studying from is
Okay. Rav Samson.
yeah.
Samson.
Samson Raphael Hirsch. He lived about
Okay,
200 years ago in Germany.
Okay, perfect. And the other one that was coming up was the verse, I will put enmity between your seed and her seed. Has that got something to do with the 2 different?
We'll get to there.
That one's coming. Yeah.
Yeah, it'll be coming up.
And the third question just was about the pastoral. What kind of challenges, and like we did so much about the agricultural. Like I wrote down a list of it, but did it say much about the pastoral?
He doesn't get. He didn't really get into the challenges of the shepherd, other than more of the benefits. He talked about the. Let me come back over here real quick.
Sorry, 1 second. I'll be back.
Okay, get over here where I was at. Oh, I laid my bookmark out, so I had to find it.
Hello.
3:16. There we go. He really gets in only on the pastoral side. He said, by contrast, he has, I guess you say he has the negatives. I mean, it's not all negative that he said about the agriculture, because he says he gave it, its due when he said that the agricultural character stimulates the development of civilization. Invention, skills may be credited to agriculture. I mean, you could say that even the tools the shepherd would use was probably invented by the agricultural side.
Mm.
If you think about that. Because I mean, just like if we move it to modern age, like myself, and I was in heating and air, we had our wrenches, our torches, our different tools for, checking pressures and things. All of that's going to be coming from, probably the agricultural way side of being, the inventive mind, that they're always looking to make things better, to make things easier. Because whereas the shepherd, as far as we're looking at the actual shepherd out on the land, he didn't really need anything but the clothes on his back
Mm.
and the food he ate. He would eat from the fields or whatever. But he discusses, I mean, he gives the benefits of the agriculture, because without it, we don't have civilization. The shepherd doesn't build the civilization. It's the agriculture. They build the cities, the roads. They're the ones who's doing all of that. Whereas the shepherd is your teachers, your professors, your doctors. See where I'm going with that? The more I've sat and I've thought about that over the last few days. So he's by contrast, the virtue and advantage of the pastoral life, the shepherd works mainly with living creatures, where the farmer is developing land. He's building buildings. He's plowing the field. He's planting. He's, like I said, he's laying out the roads. He's building the buildings, building the infrastructure of civilization. That's agricultural.
Is
The
it
shepherd
possible? Oh, sorry,
Go
go
ahead.
ahead. No, you
No, go
keep
ahead.
going. I was just
But
going to say, is it possible to have both both of them within? My mother's a teacher and my father's a builder, but I feel like that they're um, both within me. Can we have, rather than it's like you're either distinctively one or the other, you can be integrated with both?
Oh yeah, I would think so.
Yeah,
I mean, I think you could have. I think you may have a dominant trait of one or the other, but the
yeah,
other is there. You know what I'm saying?
yeah.
Uh, it it's kind of like with my daughter, my oldest daughter, and her husband. She went to school and she has her degrees and master degrees in marketing. He's an engineer. He's the one who designs. I mean, the engineering that he does is what he was trained to. Teacher would come in and bring an object and set it on the table and says, now design a machine to make that.
Mm.
And that's where his mind's at, is in designing equipment, making machines to build and to do things. She's more on the shepherd side, and he's more on the agricultural side with that mentality. But can you have both? I think you can. I've had a few jobs where it was not necessarily service related, and but I fit more into service related. I'm more comfortable inside myself with service related jobs, because that's just what I've always done. But can someone have both? Yeah. I don't think it's a stone rule that you're one or the other. I think what we're learning here is that these two exist. Since that's one thing I love about Genesis, the beginning. The first two, husband and wife, the first two children, all gives us a picture of what humanity developed into, is out of these characteristics of the first two of the each.
Mm. Yeah.
We're kind of getting a behind the scenes, wise man the way he is. I'm seeing a lot of philosophy in Torah, the philosophical aspect of how man. That's one thing I loved about it, is we were going through the first week, the creation week of Genesis. We've seen how God progressed in his each step, and we talked about he progressed freedom. His when he created plants, they were alive, they were free, but they couldn't move. Then he brought animals in, and they were alive and they could move. That when he brought man in, man could it was alive, he was moving, but he had a mind to make a choice on how he moved.
Mm.
You can see just how the development of life and freedom and movement developed in the creation week toward man. And that's the same way with like Cain and Abel. We see here these two occupations kind of represents humanity. And we're kind of getting a sense of now we can look at humanity in a way that, okay, there's agriculture, there's pastoral, and we can start understanding how things are moving.
And what just came to me then was the agriculture was a struggle with land, and then that's with the idolatry and what, and the pastoral. If I had to think of it's the struggle with God, like all of the forefathers, they're all struggling with God and being like that upright character. So that would be their struggle, not the other way of idolatry. And
They're trying to understand.
Right?
Yeah, trying to understand how man works in his relationship with the society, that's one where I like how he says the thing I picked up really good on this description from Rabbi Hirsch is that the shepherd works mainly with living creatures instead of objects, where agriculture works more with objects, land, tools, business. And it says it has a tendency to develop human feelings of tenderness and empathy. His property is movable. So I find that really interesting. But I can see because he's sitting there, he has time to think. So he's struggling. It's kind of like with this issue when Jacob was given the name Israel. He struggled with God. And so you can probably see a lot of self-development and self-awareness within the shepherd. He's constantly struggling with himself and how he fits in not only with God, but with the rest of creation.
And God's image.
Yeah, God's image.
A big one to uphold. Yeah. Thank you, Terry.
You're welcome. Anything else? Linda, did you have your hand up? Nope. Okay. All right, Ronald.
Well, we can wrap it up for the week.
Next week we will. He covers. Let me get over here to it. Where am I at? He covers 3 through 6 all together. I will start on that. If we finish 3 through 6, that'll be good. If we don't, we might have a part 1, part 2 on the next 3 verses. Because he's got those. Because I went, wait a minute here. I don't know if I might not want to go into verse 6 because I want verse 6 and 7 together.
I've noticed a comment from Sharon on YouTube.
Okay, go ahead.
You'll have to try and connect it. I'm not sure where it goes, but isn't that the meaning of the word Israel, struggle with God?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I get.
Yeah, that's even though Israel is the shepherd nation and the nations kind of represent the agriculture, that doesn't mean that there's not shepherd people within those nations. And so, and if you really look at it, a lot of people struggle with God. I mean, there could be agricultural people who struggle with God. That's the shepherd side of themselves struggling, not necessarily fighting, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah. And that's twofold because Jacob was given the name Israel himself, but it also applies to the nation. So you've got the nation struggling as well. And you notice that sometimes Jacob's called Jacob and sometimes he's called Israel. It depends on what's going on.
Yeah, I noticed. I think it's in Isaiah. I think it's Isaiah 2, where it says, that the nations will come to Jerusalem, to the mount of the God of to the temple of the God of Jacob.
Yeah,
it's interesting. I caught that one day when I was looking at that. He doesn't say the God of Israel, but he says to the temple the nations will come to the temple of the God of Jacob
And it
to
appears,
learn his ways and to walk in his paths.
it
So that was
appears,
one of those instances where he used Jacob instead of Israel.
and he uses Jacob when he's more personal, and then Israel when he's
Israel, when he's
talking to
more
the whole nation, talking about the
when he's
whole
communal.
nation. Yep. And that's why it jumps backwards and forwards. If you didn't know that, it makes you able to pinpoint what's going on a bit better, because when he's talking Jacob, generally he's talking personally, and then if he says Israel, he's talking about the whole nation.
the communal.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. Going on with on a different tangent from the previous chapter, taking us through the growth of the family.
Yeah, so next week will probably be 3, 4, and 5. We're going to get into his offerings next week.
Mhm.
I'll try to do 3, 4, and 5 because I want to save 6 and 7 together
Mhm.
because 7 is my baby. That's the one I love.
Yeah, I know.
My wife for years says there's two conversations that can happen with you. It can be Star Trek or Genesis 4:7 or Genesis in general. All conversations either goes back to Genesis or back to Star Trek.
Have you got something else, Anne?
I did. I just had another thing that I was thinking that when Rebecca was pregnant with Jacob and Esau and they were wrestling inside the two nations, this is right?
Yeah, two nations of Ishmael and Isaac.
No, Jacob and Esau.
I mean Jacob and Esau.
Yeah. So it's sort of because even I don't know if I'll go into that, but yeah, it's like you can see all the nations and what they're following, and then there's the ones that are following Jacob. So it's like that's separate.
Since you brought that up, this is
Oh.
a completely side note, totally different from our discussion. But the way you said that, I listened to one of Tovia's messages this afternoon while I was waiting to get off work, and because I got in the afternoons I got to sit at the desk and watch emails coming through, and so I had Rabbi Singer up, and he brought up something I had never heard before that was really amazing. He talks about there's 10 chapters on Tyre.
Oh, yeah.
Have you seen that one, Ronald?
Yeah. I watched that yesterday, and I hadn't
Tyre
sort of
was
considered
like
Tyre at all.
like the best friend. Tyre was the best friend of Israel, but its downfall that brought its destruction was haughtiness.
Mm.
And he said, there's, people are always saying, where's the United States and all this stuff? And he goes, I've always questioned, God doesn't put nothing in his Torah and his Tanakh for no reason at all. It's there for a reason. See, there's 10 chapters there. And he goes, he goes, now this is me. This is not rabbinic teaching. He says, but what I see here is Tyre can represent the United States. It's right now, it's the best friend of Israel. It's very strong and it can go haughty really quick,
Mm.
And I'm like, and when you said that, that in the nations, the pictures of the nation, it's a part of the Tanakh that I hadn't known much about before till today, and how we've got to watch, us in the United States, we've got to watch as a nation. Our government needs to watch that we don't get so haughty that we put ourselves above Israel, because when that happens, it can be our downfall. And if our president makes the wrong decisions, it could turn south on us really quick as far as our relationship. And I'm like, wow, God doesn't leave nothing out.
I think
When you
Toby
said
is.
that, it reminded me. Just when you said that, it reminded me of that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I think I'll have a look for that episode, or maybe Ronald
Oh.
can point me in the direction.
Yeah,
The
Yeah,
ruddy red hair Trump. That was other. I think Tovia said because he's ruddy red hair, he's a bit like Esau.
yeah. I can't remember the name of that one, Ronald. You'll have to look that one up. It's one of his new ones. He's talking with someone, another rabbi or,
yeah, he's
or somebody.
talking to the guy from Harsher Inspired,
Yeah.
the rabbi from there.
And it's kind of toward the end of the video when he's
Yeah.
talking about that. But it's worth the whole thing's worth listening to. It's really good.
Yeah, well, it'll be in my history anyway, because it was only yesterday, so it will be an easy one to find.
Fine. Yeah.
Thank you, Ronald.
All righty, Ronald.
Okay.
You know me. You keep me going. I can keep going.
Yeah.
Y'all just might not want to.
Yeah.
My other question, I just wanted to ask: are we going to go through the whole of the Chumash, or just Genesis?
Oh no, my primary was Genesis 1 through 9.
Yeah.
We might skip over and look at 18. I also want to get back several years ago, underneath my teacher. I did a teaching on the book of Jonah that I have here. That's really good. It took about 20 weeks to go through that, because I don't just go through the passages. I go through Jonah the man, Jonah the prophet, all the things that's taught about him like that. And then may not take as long as it did then, but I eventually want to go back through Jonah again, because I've had some people asking me about that here recently.
That would be great. And is this on every Thursday at this time?
Yes.
It'll change in a couple of weeks, because next
yeah,
week will be 10:30 or 11. I'm here at 10:30. And then we come out of daylight saving down here, so I'll adjust it. But next week will be 11 o'clock Melbourne time. The following week, I don't make predictions on it, because if I try to work it out before it happens, I always end up messing it up, and then I have to go and do a whole lot of editing and a whole heap of posts.
I'll follow your posts, Ronald.
Okay. Rightio. Well, thank you, everybody. Thanks. Good discussion on top of the lesson this morning. It's been great. And we will see. We're locked in on Anne's home screen.
Do what?
Oh, well, there we go. I don't know what that did, but yeah. Okay, we're back. Well, we're back to. Oh, that's right. We were in gallery. We didn't go to gallery, did we? We used to go to gallery when we came back, but as you kept going, I left it on speaker.
That's okay.
Yeah. No, yeah. Well, it was still continuing on, so didn't need to bring it back to the gallery. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody, and we will see you the same time next week.
Yes. Thanks everybody for coming.
Okay.
See you guys.
I'll stop the recording.
Hey, Veronica, are we doing book thing?
Yeah. For tomorrow, yeah.
I haven't stopped the